What if every vote you cast is, in fact, an agreement to your own subjugation? What if the political system we've come to celebrate as the pinnacle of human achievement is actually a cleverly marketed form of tyranny? This realization is a shattering one. When millions of Americans watched the 2016 election results, a profound shift occurred. People who had long trusted the democratic process began questioning whether ordinary citizens could truly wield political power. This cognitive dissonance is harsh, but not new. Over 2,400 years ago, Plato observed the execution of his mentor Socrates by a democratic mob and came to a chilling conclusion. Democracy doesn't free people from tyranny. It makes tyranny feel like freedom. Modern psychology has tragically confirmed Plato's warning. The 1950s Ashkenformity experiment showed that 75% of people would abandon their own perceptions to avoid disagreement with a group. If we can't trust ourselves to identify an obvious truth, how can we trust millions of strangers to choose our leaders wisely? Here's what should disturb you. In 2006, Emory University researchers conducted brain scans of partisan individuals as they processed information about their political choices. When confronted with evidence that contradicted or disproved their beliefs, the part of the brain linked to critical reasoning showed no increased activity. Instead, the emotional circuits lit up. Subjects didn't just dismiss painful facts. Their brains were actively pushing them to avoid cognitive dissonance. Our brains are designed to embrace democratic manipulation, and that's how the system maintains its control. To understand why modern democracy functions as a political dictatorship, we must first understand what democracy promises. It offers something psychologically unattainable: the belief that your voice matters, that you are essential, and that complex social issues can be solved through collective wisdom. Compared to overt tyranny, secret police, censorship, and heavy repression, democratic systems seem to provide a better version of human dignity and individual freedom. But as Plato pointed out, the most effective form of control doesn't feel like control at all. Democracy has perfected a form of governance that is inherently unsustainable. Participation in our own subjugation feels like a blessing in disguise. Notice how this works psychologically. Traditional dictatorships achieve compliance through overt oppression. People know they're being controlled, and they develop underground networks, secret codes, and revolutionary movements. However, democratic systems co-opt those same networks into closed-loop mechanisms: voting, protests, petitions that offer psychological satisfaction without threatening the power structure itself. This is the psychological brilliance called competitive authoritarianism by political scientist Stephen Levitsky. You may feel like you're fighting the system when you vote against the establishment, but you're actually tapping into a network that upholds your choices. As Plato observed, the hardest policies to challenge are those enforced by someone who seems just like you. Yet democracy ensures you never realize how little power your leaders actually hold because you chose them. Your autonomy and rational decision-making are essential for true authority. Democracy gives the illusion of both, while ensuring that all meaningful decisions align with the same agenda. The House always wins, but you continue to believe that each choice is your own. Plato's most prescient insight is understanding how the freedoms of democracy ultimately lead to destruction. In the Republic, he outlined progression. Democracy creates cognitive overload, which feeds into the rise of demagogues, ultimately leading to tyranny disguised as popular will. Modern neuroscience explains why this progression is almost inevitable. When faced with an overwhelming influx of information, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for critical thinking, shuts down, and the limbic system takes over, making decisions based on emotion and instinct rather than analysis. This phenomenon is known as choice overload. Too many options disorient decision-makers and create chaos for governments that promise to solve everything. The trajectory of Venezuela's downfall illustrates this perfectly. Hugo Chavez didn't seize power through military force. He won 56% of the vote in 1998 by promising solutions to the complex political problems facing the country. People didn't vote for tyranny. They voted for psychological comfort. By the time they realized the consequences, their emotional investment in Chavez made it almost impossible to turn back. Today, the same trend is visible across the globe. Country by country, governments elect leaders who promise to relieve their cognitive burden. Leaders who think for them make decisions for them, and take on responsibilities they no longer wish to bear. This is the weakness of democracy. It systematically produces leaders skilled in winning elections, but not in leading effectively. This skill set is sometimes at odds with the ability to make complex decisions. What makes a leader attractive psychologically? Trust, simplicity, emotional resonance is vastly different from what's required to inspire humility, complexity, and analytical thought. Plato captured this in his metaphor of the bad ship. Imagine a ship where the passengers choose who will navigate it. The skilled navigators understand wind patterns, celestial navigation, and the complexities of the sea, but sound unsure when explaining maritime challenges. Meanwhile, a charismatic passenger promises smooth sailing in fair weather, confidently dismissing the experts as elitists. Who do you think the passengers will choose? And what happens to the ship? Plato's solution was that the philosopher king, chosen for wisdom rather than popularity, sounds elitist because we don't value expertise in politics. We don't choose our surgeons, research scientists, or academic theorists based on popularity. We choose those who have spent decades mastering complex knowledge. But in politics, wisdom becomes a liability. True leaders are accustomed to uncertainty, to acknowledging complexity, and to recognizing their limitations. This often leads to what's called moral evil. We are uncomfortable with uncertainty and tend to choose certainty, even when it's wrong. The 2008 financial crisis perfectly illustrates this dynamic. Economists have been warning for years that the housing bubble was unsustainable, but their voices were dismissed as academic and uncertain. Meanwhile, those without economic expertise promised that the market would keep rising indefinitely. The market trusted the confident voices, and the truth acted catastrophically. This isn't just about individual psychology. It's about how democratic institutions systematically choose leaders who don't have the necessary expertise. We trust people who can take years to craft promises they know they can't keep. These behaviors require specific personality traits: narcissism, comfort with manipulation, and tolerance for cognitive dissonance. Traits that aren't necessarily linked to wisdom or competence. Look at your current political leaders. Are they the wisest, most competent people you know? Or are they the most ambitious, persuasive, and eager to tell you what you want to hear? Plato's ideal regime wasn't about perfect government. It was about a system where power is held by those who understand its true nature rather than those who crave it. As Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, how many problems did he avoid by not listening to what people said or did? Leadership in politics requires focusing on the issues rather than popularity, which makes democratic systems nearly impossible to sustain. Plato's allegory of the cave isn't just a philosophical metaphor. It's a technical manual for understanding how modern systems of information shape democratic consciousness. We are all attached to our tools, seeing the light that is carefully curated by algorithms to maximize engagement and minimize discomfort. But this is what makes modern democratic control more sophisticated than what Plato envisioned. The light is personalized. Your social media feed, news sources, and suggested content are tailored to reinforce your beliefs while creating the illusion of choice and information. You're not just seeing the same light as everyone else. You're seeing the light that's suggested for your psychological profile. The Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed something even more disturbing. Using psychological profiles built from Facebook data, political operatives targeted individuals with custom messages that were designed to appeal to their weaknesses. The anxious were given fear-based content. The narcissistic were given content that made them feel special and informed. The depressed were given content that reinforced their negative worldview. This is not traditional propaganda that's aimed at everyone. This is a psychological battle being waged specifically against you. It creates what psychology calls confirmation bias on steroids. Traditional propaganda forced everyone to see the same information. Modern democratic systems allow people to choose a reality that reinforces their beliefs while making them feel more informed than ever. The result is political polarization, coupled with a comforting belief that you're on the right side. During major political events, those consuming different streams of information don't just disagree on policy. They experience completely different realities. They see different facts, different opinions, and different moral frameworks to understand the same event. Both groups feel completely informed and morally superior, while being systematically manipulated by forces they don't even recognize. This is happening to you right now. As you watch this, algorithms are studying your preferences. Political operatives are crafting messages for your demographic, and your information environment is quietly being customized to influence your opinions and divisions in ways you don't even realize. This is why fact-checking fails, and why political debates are becoming more simplistic. When people encounter information that contradicts their customized reality, they don't change their minds. They experience what's known as a backfire effect and become more convinced of their original position. Plato was right. They saw him as their worst enemy, telling them the truth. In a democratic society, enlightenment through truth is stopped not by printing presses, but by algorithmic suppression and social rejection. The system doesn't need to silence the truth. It just needs to make the truth feel uncomfortable and psychologically worthless. The Weimar Republic provides the clearest example of how democratic psychology enables tyrannical outcomes. Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s was a functioning democracy with personal freedoms, competitive elections, and active political debate. But when an economic crisis and political instability created cognitive overload, the German electorate did not resist authoritarianism. They welcomed it. Hitler's rise reveals something crucial about democratic weaknesses. People don't choose tyranny because they enjoy oppression. They choose it because freedom becomes psychologically intolerable. When your prefrontal cortex is overwhelmed by complexity and uncertainty, your limbic system takes over and desires an easy emotional solution. The success of the Nazi regime didn't stem from exposing humanity's worst evil. It came from offering a solution to the uncomfortable freedom of democracy. Hitler promised to handle everything: the economy, foreign policy, social issues. So ordinary Germans no longer had to worry about issues they felt were beyond their ability to judge. This pattern repeats throughout history because it exploits human psychological features rather than temporary political circumstances. Athens executed Socrates not because Athenians were cruel, but because his questions forced them to confront their own habits, something the democratic system systematically shamed. Meanwhile, the transformation of the Roman Republic into an empire followed the sequence Plato predicted. Roman leaders realized they could gain more power by appealing directly to popular support than by demonstrating competence through traditional institutions. Politicians like Julius Caesar knew that promising bread and circuses was more effective than showcasing administrative skill. This psychological manipulation mirrors modern populism. Complex problems with simple solutions, a clearly defined enemy to punish, and charismatic leaders who promise to fight for the people against corrupt elites. The fact that these leaders themselves are often incompetent is beside the point. What matters is emotional satisfaction of feeling represented and empowered. Look around the world today. How many democracies are experiencing this dynamic? How many populations are electing strongmen who promise to think for them, make decisions for them, and take on the complex problems they no longer want to address? One of Plato's most controversial ideas is the noble lie, the notion that effective governance may require a shared myth to maintain social cohesion. Viewers often dismiss this as proto-fascist thinking, but they miss something crucial. Every political system relies on myths based on legitimacy, progress, and purpose. The difference between the noble lie and the myths of democracy lies in their justice and intensity. Plato wanted carefully held myths, upheld by wise leaders who understood their functions and limitations. Democratic systems spontaneously generate myths through chaotic interests, media narratives, and social psychology without taking responsibility for the consequences. Notice some of the myths of democracy: that every citizen is entitled to equal weight regardless of knowledge or wisdom, that complex social issues can be solved through governance processes, that the majority rule creates wise outcomes, and that political leaders represent interests rather than their own psychological needs. These myths are not true, but they are not entirely false either. They function to make democratic participation feel meaningful and morally justified, rather than revealing how the political system truly works. The psychological problem with the mythology of democracy is that it prevents honest engagement with political reality. Instead of acknowledging the decisions, conflicts, and weaknesses of the system, democratic culture has become accustomed to promising impossible outcomes: freedom without responsibility, choices without consequences, representation without elite influence. When these realities inevitably fall short of these promises, the democratic system creates what cognitive psychology calls dissonance. the uncomfortable tension between belief and experience. Rather than confronting these unrealistic expectations, people usually blame specific leaders, parties, or groups while maintaining faith in the system itself. This leads to division and the proliferation of demagogues who promise to make those lies come true. Understanding democracy as a political dictatorship requires examining not only psychological manipulation, but also institutional design. Democratic systems appear to divide power extensively, but in reality, they concentrate it in less visible ways. Notice how modern democratic governments function. Elected leaders make highly visible decisions on relatively minor issues, while more significant policies, monetary policy, regulatory frameworks, international treaties, are controlled by unelected governments, technological experts, and massive international organizations that operate outside the pressure of democracy. For example, in the European Union, the European Commission, an unelected body, initiates legislation and enforces compliance among member states, while the directly elected European Parliament holds much less power than many citizens realize. National leaders campaign on domestic issues, but once in power, they often defer to supranational regulations that cannot be changed. Voters are given the illusion of influence in a system where the most consequential decisions are made elsewhere. This creates what political scientists call a democratic deficit. Important decisions are made by people who are not accountable to the public, while elected officials have limited power that actually affects citizens' lives. Meanwhile, the democratic aspects, campaigns, debates, elections, consume vast psychological energy while having minimal impact on substantive policy. Voters feel deeply connected to the political process, while real power operates through channels they barely recognize. This institutional setup activates various psychological functions. It provides emotional satisfaction for political interests while ensuring that those interests don't threaten the power structure. It creates legitimate tools for frustration and despair while channeling that energy into pointless pursuits. Most importantly, it makes people feel responsible for decisions they don't control. When democratic governments produce disappointing results, the public blames themselves for voting poorly rather than questioning whether they ever had meaningful choices in the first place. When governments fail, the response is usually a call for more democracy, more participation, more transparency, more political competition, rather than considering whether the democratic process itself could produce better results. This is the genius of the system. It makes you complicit in your own failure while convincing you that you're in control. Before dismissing Plato's critique outright, we must acknowledge its flaws and consider the strongest contradictions within democratic theory. Joseph Schumpeter's theory of competitive democracy, for example, doesn't argue that government makes wise political choices, but that the competition among leaders creates incentives for them to serve the public's desires, much like how market competition benefits consumers without requiring them to understand the production process. This theory has some merits. Democratic systems create mechanisms for peaceful leadership transitions, institutional checks on power, and feedback loops between governments and citizens. Even imperfect democratic processes can prevent the worst forms of evil by making it difficult for any one leader or group to consolidate permanent control. Moreover, historical examples exist of democratic systems that resisted demagoguery and made long-term, complex decisions. For example, the Marshall Plan required the U.S. government to support an expensive international aid program with unclear direct benefits. Environmental regulations are often passed despite their immediate economic costs. Sometimes democratic processes produce competent leaders who prioritize governance over popularity. However, these examples do not invalidate Plato's basic understanding of democratic psychology. They only show that the path from democracy to tyranny is not inevitable, just possible. The psychological weaknesses Plato identified remain a real and constant threat to democratic governments. Moreover, the practical issues with alternatives are numerous. How can truly wise leaders be identified and chosen? What prevents philosopher kings from being corrupted by power or isolated from the people they govern? How can we ensure that the need for wisdom isn't just another form of self-interest? Plato himself seemed to recognize these difficulties, presenting his ideal state more as a thought experiment to understand political psychology than as a practical blueprint for reform. So, What do we do with this uncomfortable knowledge? Plato's answer was not to abandon political engagement, but to approach it with a deep awareness of its psychological mechanisms. In times of chaos, philosophy requires moral action. To return to education, even knowing that most people will reject uncomfortable truths. This means approaching democratic processes as a conscious participant rather than an unaware victim. Instead of expecting democracy to be something it's not, a system for translating popular wisdom into effective governance, we can appreciate for what it truly is, a method of managing human psychological needs while maintaining relative social stability. Wisdom doesn't solve the fundamental problems with democratic governance, but it alters your relationship with political participation. When you understand how your brain is manipulated by confident leaders, emotional appeals, and social identities, you can develop resistance to these influences. When you recognize that your political opinions are shaped more by psychological needs than rational analysis, you can become more humble about your beliefs and more curious about perspectives that challenge your assumptions. When you understand how democratic institutions embed these needs into their dysfunction, you can think more strategically about where to focus your energy. Most importantly, wisdom allows you to engage in political systems without being psychologically overwhelmed by them. You can vote, advocate, and engage while maintaining a critical distance from the manipulative methodologies that make these activities feel more meaningful than they truly are. This isn't about cynicism or disengagement. It's about engaging smarter by fully understanding the psychological mechanisms at work. Plato believed that political systems reflect the psychological character of their people. If he was right, then the type of democracy we get is the type we deserve, not because of our goodness, but because of our cognitive weaknesses and emotional needs. We want to feel informed without doing the hard work of learning. We want to feel free without accepting the responsibilities that come with true freedom. We want simple answers to complex problems, confident leaders in uncertain times, and someone to blame when something goes wrong. Democracy gives us exactly that. A sense of political agency without its substance, the pleasure of collective decision-making without individual responsibility, the fullness of moral superiority without the pressure of moral consistency. Yet understanding these dynamics is the first step in taking it back. When we stop expecting democracy to be something it's not, we can begin to approach it more strategically and less emotionally. When we recognize our own psychological weaknesses, we can begin to resist manipulation. Now, as you watch this, the same psychological mechanisms that destroyed democratic institutions in Germany, Venezuela, and many other countries are operating in your own country. The personal information offenses that turn friends into enemies are targeting your social media feeds. The excesses that make people love sameness bring people to wonder every day. Demagogues are already among us, proving the collapse of complexity and the faith needed for freedom. They garner support not because people are evil, but because they are stressed by the psychological fears of democratic exhaustion, stressed by choices they feel unqualified to make, stressed by the responsibilities of self-governance. The question is not whether modern democracy functions as a political dictatorship. Plato's analysis makes it clear. The question is whether you will participate with full awareness of the psychological mechanisms at play, or continue to walk through the motions while real power operates outside your consciousness. This choice isn't about cynicism or idealism. It's about justice and injustice. Plato saw this choice coming over 2 millennia ago. He saw it in ancient Athens, predicting that it would repeat throughout history, and his view applies perfectly to our contemporary situation. The only difference is that our democratic illusion is more sophisticated, our psychological manipulation simpler, and our need for uncomfortable self-justice more pressing than ever. Your brain wants you to reject this message because it disrupts your comfortable beliefs about the system you live in. That reaction? That's exactly what Plato was talking about. The choice is to think through that reaction. It's the first step toward true freedom. An unexamined democracy is not worth preserving, and an unexamined people are not truly free. The most dangerous tyranny is the one that feels like freedom, and your brain is wired to love it. Question your assumptions. Seek the uncomfortable truth. The shadows on the floor are more beautiful than the truth, but only the truth can set you free. The grave is comfortable, but the choice to walk toward the light, that choice is still yours. For now, you've just explored a new way of seeing life with Coded Life. If these ideas inspire you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. So together, we can keep decoding the mind in the modern world.